You know, I always thought the worst thing about moving to a quiet neighborhood would be nosy neighbors asking too many questions at the mailbox. Boy, was I wrong. What actually happened was so much worse and so much more satisfying that I still can't believe it went down the way it did. So picture this. I'm Sarah, and about 3 years ago, I bought this beautiful little ranch house on Maple Creek Road. It's nothing fancy, just a cozy two-bedroom with a decent yard and this gorgeous old oak tree out front that sold me on the place. Immediately. The house sits on about an acre and a half of land that backs up to some undeveloped woods. Perfect for someone like me who values privacy and quiet. When I first moved in, it was just me and a handful of other houses, scattered along the road, peaceful, exactly what I was looking for after years of apartment, living in the city. I could sit on my back porch with my morning coffee and actually hear birds instead of traffic. It was paradise. But you know how these things go, right? Paradise never lasts. About 18 months after I settled in, construction crews started showing up. Heavy machinery, survey stakes, the whole 9 yards. They were building a new subdivision called Willowbrook Estates right behind my property. At first, I didn't mind. Progress is progress. And honestly, having some neighbors might be nice. The houses they built were gorgeous. We're talking pristine 2-story colonials with perfectly manicured lawns, decorative lampposts, and driveways that looked like they were pressure washed daily. The kind of neighborhood where every mailbox matches. And there's probably a rule about what color you can paint your front door. Now, my little ranch house? Well, let's just say it has character. The paint could use some touching up. I've got a vegetable garden that some might call rustic, and my driveway is gravel because I actually like the sound it makes when I pull in after work. It's homey. It's lived in. It's mine. For about 6 months after Willowbrook Estates was completed, everything was fine. I'd wave to my new neighbors when I saw them. They'd wave back, and we all minded our own business. I should have known it was too good to last. The trouble started with Linda Morrison, the self-appointed queen bee of Willowbrook Estates. Linda was one of those women who wore pearls to check the mail and probably ironed her dish towels. She lived in the biggest house at the end of the cul-de-sac, a massive colonial with columns that made it look like a miniature plantation house. First encountered Linda at the grocery store. I was in the cereal aisle minding my own business when this perfectly coiffed woman approached me with the kind of smile that doesn't reach your eyes. "You must be Sarah," she said, extending a manicured hand. "I'm Linda Morrison, HOA President of Willowbrook Estates. We're practically neighbors." I shook her hand and smiled back. "Nice to meet you, Linda. I love what you all have done with the development. It's beautiful." "Thank you," she said, and then her expression shifted slightly. "You know, we've been meaning to reach out to you about possibly joining our homeowners association. We're all about maintaining property values and community standards." Something in her tone made my stomach tighten, but I kept it polite. "Oh, that's nice of you to think of me. But I'm not actually part of Willowbrook Estates. My house predates the development." Linda's smile faltered for just a second. "Well, yes, but you're right there on the border. It would really benefit everyone if we could present a unified front, aesthetically speaking." "I appreciate the offer," I said, grabbing my cereal and preparing to make my escape. "But I'm happy managing my own property. Thanks, though." As I walked away, I could feel her eyes boring into my back. I should have known that wouldn't be the end of it. 2 weeks later, I found the first letter in my mailbox. Official Willowbrook Estates HOA letterhead, addressed to property owner at 1247 Maple Creek Road. That's my address, but I'm not part of their HOA, so I almost threw it away. Curiosity got the better of me, though. The letter was polite but firm. It informed me that my property was in violation of several community standards. My grass was too long. It wasn't. My garden was not in keeping with neighborhood aesthetics. It's a vegetable garden, not a junkyard. And my mailbox needed to be replaced with one that matched the subdivision standard. Laughed it off and tossed the letter in the recycling bin. They had no authority over my property, and I figured they'd realize their mistake soon enough. But the letters kept coming. Every 2 weeks, like clockwork, another violation notice would appear in my mailbox. My fence was too tall. My car was parked in my driveway for more than 24 hours. Apparently, that's a violation in their world. My outdoor furniture was non-compliant with community guidelines. After the 6th letter, I decided enough was enough. I called the number on the letterhead and asked to speak with Linda Morrison. "Sarah," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "I'm so glad you called. We've been trying to help you understand the importance of community standards." "Linda," I said, keeping my voice calm, "I need you to understand something. I'm not part of your HOA. I never signed any agreements. I don't pay dues, and you have no authority over my property. Please stop sending me these letters." There was a pause, and when Linda spoke again, her voice was colder. "Sarah, dear, I think you're confused about property boundaries. When you live in a community, you have responsibilities to that community. I don't live in your community," I said. "I live next to it. There's a difference." "We'll see about that," Linda said, and hung up. That should have been my first real warning. But I honestly thought the whole thing was just a misunderstanding that would blow over. I was so wrong. The letters stopped for about a month, and I thought maybe Linda had finally gotten the message. Then one Friday afternoon, I came home from work to find something that made my blood run cold. Taped to my front gate was an official-looking document with eviction notice, printed in bold red letters across the top. It had the Willowbrook Estates HOA letterhead and was signed by Linda Morrison in her capacity as HOA President. The notice gave me 72 hours to vacate my property for continued violations of community standards and failure to comply with HOA regulations. It threatened legal action if I didn't comply. I stood there staring at that paper, shaking with rage. They were trying to evict me from my own home, the home I owned free and clear, the property I had every legal right to live on. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about that eviction notice and Linda Morrison's smug face. But as I tossed and turned, something nagged at the back of my mind. Something my grandfather had told me years ago about our family property. The next morning, I drove to my parents' house and dug through my grandfather's old papers in their attic. What I found changed everything. My grandfather, Robert Chen, had owned over 200 acres of land in this area back in the 1970s and 80s, when developers started approaching him in the late 90s. He was smart about how he sold it off. He kept detailed records of every transaction, every easement, every right he retained, and there it was, in black and white, when he sold the 50 acres that eventually became Willowbrook Estates. He kept the mineral rights and retained permanent easement, access to the natural gas pipeline that ran under the property. More importantly, he kept ownership of the small parcel where their community center and HOA office now stood. When my grandfather passed 5 years ago, all of those rights and that parcel came to me. I owned the land their precious clubhouse was built on, and they'd never bothered to check. I spent the entire weekend at the county clerk's office, pulling surveys, deed records, and easement documents. By Sunday evening, I had a stack of paperwork 3 inches thick that proved beyond any doubt that Linda Morrison and her HOA had been operating their community center on land they didn't own. Monday morning, I called a lawyer. By Tuesday, I had filed papers with the county asserting my ownership rights and demanding immediate cessation of all unauthorized use of my property. Then came the fun. Part Wednesday afternoon, I had a crew install a beautiful new fence around the community center and HOA office. Nothing dramatic, just a nice wooden fence with several private property no trespassing signs posted at regular intervals. I also had the locks changed on the community center's main entrance. I was sitting on my front porch with a cup of coffee when Linda Morrison's white Mercedes came screeching into my driveway at about 4. She practically flew out of her car, clutching that eviction notice in her perfectly manicured hands. "What do you think you're doing?" she shrieked, waving the paper at me. "You can't block access to our community center." I took a slow sip of my coffee and looked at her calmly. "Linda, I'm not blocking access to anything. I'm simply controlling access to my own property. Her face went 3 shades of red. Your property? That's community land. The developer sold it to the HOA. Actually, I said, pulling out my own stack of papers, the developer never owned it to sell. My grandfather retained ownership when he sold this parcel in 1998. Would you like to see the deed? Linda's eyes went wide as she looked at the official county documents. This can't be right. It's very right, I said. And you know what else is right? This eviction notice you taped to my gate. It constitutes harassment and potentially criminal. Impersonation of legal authority. I stood up and walked over to where she was standing in my driveway. Linda, I'm going to give you the same 72 hours you gave me. You have 72 hours to remove all HOA property from my land and cease all unauthorized use, or I'll be filing trespassing charges. She sputtered and stammered, but eventually got back in her Mercedes and peeled out of my driveway. Over the next few days, my phone didn't stop ringing. First Linda called, then other HOA board members, then their lawyer. Every conversation went basically the same way. They'd demand I stop blocking access to their community center. I'd politely explain that it was my land, and they'd hang up in frustration. The breaking point came on Friday when I found Linda Morrison standing in my backyard, apparently trying to find some other way to access the community center. When she saw me, she actually had the nerve to look indignant. "You can't keep us from our own building," she shouted. "Ma'am," I said, pulling out my phone, "you're trespassing on private property. I'm calling the sheriff." That got her attention. She practically ran back to her car, but not before screaming something about lawyers and property rights. The sheriff's deputy, who responded, was actually quite amused by the whole situation once. I showed him the documentation. He agreed to have a conversation with Linda about respecting property boundaries and the legal definition of trespassing. But the real victory came 2 weeks later when Linda Morrison showed up at my door with her lawyer and a very different attitude. "Sarah," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "we'd like to discuss a resolution to this situation." I invited them in and offered coffee, which they declined. Linda's lawyer, a nervous-looking man in an expensive suit, spread some papers on my kitchen table. "My client would like to propose a lease agreement for the land under the community center," he said. "We're prepared to offer fair market value for the rental." I looked at the papers. The proposed monthly lease payment was more than my mortgage. "This seems reasonable," I said, "but I have one condition." Linda looked up hopefully. "What's that?" I walked to my mantel and picked up the eviction notice, which I had indeed framed and hung in a place of honor. "I want a written apology," I said. "From you personally, Linda, acknowledging that you overstepped your authority and harassed me with fraudulent legal documents." Linda's face cycled through about 5 different emotions before settling on resigned defeat. "Fine," she said. "Today, I collect a monthly check from the Willowbrook Estates HOA for the privilege of using their own community center." Linda Morrison steps off the sidewalk when she sees me coming, and I haven't received a single violation notice since. And that eviction notice? It's still hanging right there above my mantel, a daily reminder that sometimes the best defense is a good stack of property deeds and the patience to let bullies hang themselves with their own rope. The funny thing is, my grass is still the same length it always was. My vegetable garden is thriving, and my gravel driveway still makes that satisfying crunch when I come home from work. The only thing that's changed is that now I'm getting paid to live exactly the way I always have. If you enjoyed this story of HOA Overreach getting exactly what it deserved, hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of neighbors, property lines, and the sweet satisfaction of legal paperwork. Trust me, I've got plenty more where this came from.